Well, good morning, good afternoon. My name's Sandy Hillen, and I am the Operations Director at PATH. And I am joined this morning by my cat, Darth, who every time I do a Zoom call, he gets in his position. I don't know if he likes seeing the people on the screen, but he's very much interested in what we're going to talk about today. And that's the adolescent brain development.
He just left.
He said, okay, no, I'm not. He's full grown, so he may not see the need to pay much attention. But he will be coming and going, so sorry for any distractions. But we're so excited to have so many people joining us today, and some will be able to see this later as a recording. And we're going to take a little different approach today in that we want this to be interactive. And so we are going to have polls and ask you to share with chat if you have a question and find some ways to make it more engaging for you. You know, we've all been going through the Zooms with COVID, and we understand that sometimes our attention may be hard to keep going with all of the distractions we have in our homes. So we're going to try to make it a little more interesting as we discuss the adolescent brain development. Our presenter today is Donna Golub. She is the Executive Director of PATH, who has been sponsoring the American Teens in Crisis Conference for many years. And some people, I think, are returning to learn more. So with that, I want to turn it over to Donna. There you go, Donna.
Perfect. Sorry, just letting people into the room. I will let you take over the room. Well, good morning. Thanks, Sandy, for welcoming everybody and co-hosting with me this morning. Sandy will be helping assist with our breakout rooms, helping me pay attention to some things in the chat box. As she said, this is our first time to do our American Teens in Crisis virtually. Usually we are all meeting and having a great breakfast right about this time and having a big lunch and getting to connect with our peers and really just enjoying each other while doing the learning. This is our 17th annual American Teens in Crisis. As many of you know, this series has turned virtual and will be a 3-session lunch and learn type event. So this is the first Adolescent Brain Development 101, and it is just that. It will definitely be a level 101 kind of a refresher for many of you, I'm sure, of adolescent brain development. I am neither a scientist nor a medical person, so what I'm sharing with you today comes from a lot of other trainings that I've attended and some of my own research as well. So by all means, I'm hoping that we're learning from and with each other today. So as you have things to share, as Sandy said, feel free to use the chat box. If you'd like to share something, raise your hand and Sandy will let us know when it's a good time for us to unmute our mics and have a conversation. We don't want to talk over each other. So there are some times when I'll say, let's talk about, and that's how we kind of like to handle that piece. Just raise your hand, Sandy will call on you, it'll be your turn to talk. And we'll try to get everybody's opinions and everybody's ideas. Like I said, I love presentations that are very interactive and conversational. So that's what my goal is today. Even though we're in a lot of different places with a lot going on around us, hopefully this is going to be an engaging and powerful time for you, and you're going to find that it was worth your time to spend with us today. We're also going to be doing lunch a little bit different. So in case you missed that memo on your agenda that was attached to the invite information, our lunch today is still going to be spent with each other, but it is going to be a lunch break. We're going to break out into lunch rooms, and Sandy will explain that to you a little bit later as we get close to that. So if you haven't taken the time while you're kind of listening, if you want to order yourself a lunch to be delivered, I'm hoping this morning's session will take about an hour to get through, and then we'll have our lunch break and move on. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get started. I am sharing my screen, but it is not moving. There we go. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to kind of spend the morning going through a little bit of the science, like I said, of the adolescent brain. We'll take that lunch break I was talking about, and then we're going to spend the last hour and a half or so together talking about, so what? Now that we know all this information about the development of the adolescent brain, what does it mean to us as practitioners, as parents, as mentors, maybe as program developers? What does that mean, and how can we put it into practical application? So let's go ahead and get started on the science of it. Again, I am not a science person or a medical person, so the information I'm sharing with you is information that I've learned and studied.
I just need to ask a quick question. Can everybody see the shared screen?
Social media.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. I know we were having a little problem there, so I wanted to make sure that people could see. Okay, it's working now. Thank you, Donna.
Yep. And if you want to enlarge your screen so you can see the PowerPoint but bigger and the people smaller, you can literally slide this screen, where all your people are, over and put it on just speaker view, and then you'll see more of the PowerPoint and less of the people. All right, are we good? Good to go? Perfect. We gotta love Zoom, right? Everybody. So I'll say this too. The most of us are working from home. So if you have a child that runs in or whatever, you have to take a moment, please do. If your doorbell rings and it's another Amazon delivery, please answer your door, do what you have to do. Like Sandy said, this is being recorded, and after this is over, probably tomorrow, you'll receive an email with a post-event survey that we'd appreciate you filling out. It will have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and it will have a recording if you want to go back and listen to it again, or maybe you want to share it with someone, that you'll have the opportunity to do that. So please, self-care is so important, and we're all a little pulled in 100 different directions right now. So take care of you, be as attentive and engaged as you can be, but we all have things that we need to take care of. So by all means, please do what you need to do to be comfortable for you. And we will take some breaks along the way for fluid level adjustments and stuff like that. But again, do whatever you need to do to be comfortable today. All right? So the development of the adolescent brain. The brain is probably the most important part of our body. It's the control center for everything that we do, for everything that we feel, for everything that we think. All of the automatic things that happen in our body, all controlled by this thing we call the brain. And the science behind the adolescent brain and its effect on youth development and educational programming continues to grow. Our research continues to grow, the data, what we know, what we learn. It all continues to grow, much like the adolescent brain. Up until about 15 years ago, it was thought that the brain was completed by the age of 5 or 6. And it is, at that age, about 95% of its full size. But that is not the end of the story. I am having issues advancing my screen. Sorry, guys. So the brain may be fully grown, but it is certainly not fully developed. The brain continues to develop for about another 10 to 15 years after it's reached its full size. Some believe that the erratic behaviors of the adolescents stem from the raging hormones of puberty. This is where we're going to launch our first poll. I'd like to know if you agree or disagree with this, with this statement. So we're going to launch a little poll here. It's real easy. The question simply is, do you agree or disagree? I'm trying to add it. Can you see it?
No, we can't see it.
Sorry. I think this is the only poll we have, so we're going to see how this works. It worked yesterday when I ran through it. I swear it did. All right. You see it now? There you go. So, do you agree or disagree with the statement that the erratic behaviors of adolescence stems from the raging hormones of puberty? Give you just another couple of seconds. All right, most of you have voted. Some of you may be on your phones, in which case I'm not sure you can participate with the poll, so I'm sorry about that. All right, we will close the poll. And 18% of you disagree with that statement. And it's a little bit of a tricky question, right? Because what is true is the hormones play a role. Sex hormones, sensitivity to physical attraction and interpersonal relationships with both estrogen and testosterone kind of coming into full bloom during this puberty type phase. And while the adolescent brain is developing, those things are definitely happening. But more importantly, the specific hormones are the broader development change that occur inside the adolescent brain. So I need to turn my poll off and go back to my screen. There we go. Sandy, I think there's questions in the chat box. Do we have a question before I move on?
People were answering the poll question.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about some of the specific changes. What seems to be the most fascinating and telling of these changes that occur in the adolescent brain has to do with the changes of the white and gray matter. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. The adolescent brain development can be divided into three very distinct processes. First, let's take a look at those processes. The first is this rapid growth of brain matter that we were talking about, and that's called proliferation. White matter consists primarily of glia and myelinated axons. Axons conduct electricity or impulses that send information and kind of are the connections that are going on in the brain. And then the gray matter refers to the cells of the body and neurons, those nerve fibers that support the cells that are making all the connections. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. The second thing that we're going to talk about is the idea of pruning. And the third process that we're going to talk a little bit more about is this myelination, which is insulating, an insulation, kind of if you have a wire like like in your telephone lines, there's a very thin wire where all of the information passes and all that communication is happening, but that very thin wire is wrapped with a rubber connection, a rubber protection that allows that speed to be even faster and less interrupted. And that's kind of what myelination is all about. The researcher Jay Guide compares this pruning to Michelangelo with a block of marble. He begins to sculpt away until David emerged. This is precisely what is happening inside the adolescent brain at starting about age 11. The brain starts to prune away or sculpt away excess material, excess connections, and make more room for more refined, more efficient, more adult-like brain matter. This process is called synapsis, and the structure of the pruning of the synapses, and it's the structures that allow for the chemical transmission in this communication that we're talking about. When an electrical impulse travels along that axon, it can activate the flow of neurotransmitters. Basically, it's the way that our neurons communicate with one another. Another way to look at this pruning is comparing it to what we do in our gardens with our bushes, right? Take just a minute in your chat box and tell me why we prune our shrubs. It's about that time of year, the weather's changing, and those of us who have shrubs outside are about ready to do some pruning. Why do we do that? Exactly. So pruning away the shrub's unused portion or portions that are weak and taking away from the strength of the whole, it allows our bushes to become fuller. It encourages new growth. That's exactly right. And the same thing is happening inside the adolescent brain. It becomes kind of a use it or lose it process for our teens. And what do I mean by that? So let's think about this. A baby's brain contains almost twice the number of synapses as an adult brain. If synapses is not used or stimulated in its environment, it's pruned away. So if there are parts of our brain as an adolescent that are not being used, that are not healthy, that are kind of withering on the vine, for lack of a better word, then the brain automatically prunes those away, just removes them. And what that allows to happen is it allows more room for growth and strengthening of those synapses that are still there, that are still functioning. So for example, if we have an adolescent who's really great with math, not so great with history, and they're not paying attention to those things and they're not using that part of their brain, pruning, right? If we have someone who's maybe really great with athletics or music and they spend a lot of time practicing and a lot of time focusing on those things that they enjoy and that they're really good at, then those things are going to grow and those areas of their brain are going to strengthen, while other areas that are not being used are going to be pruned away. This is part of why it's really important that during adolescent years, we give our teens the opportunity to be well-rounded and exposed to many things, so that they can kind of pick and choose, and so that their brain has a chance to filter all of these experiences. So by reducing the number of connections in the brain through this pruning process, we actually end up with a more efficient brain. Similar to the pruning of a bush, by clearing out dead wood, we create some space for new growth to occur, and the branches that are left have the opportunity to grow much stronger. This synaptic pruning process is key to what takes place during the adolescent years. It allows unnecessary brain connections to be eliminated while important connections are maintained and strengthened. Research has proven that the environmental and environmental enrichment has a direct effect on the growth of these signal receivers in the brain. So let me repeat that. It is proven that environmental enrichment has a direct effect on the way a brain receives information. We're going to talk a lot more about what that means to us as practitioners and as parents this afternoon. But I think that's really key, and we want to make sure that we remember that. It has a lot more to do with what's happening outside of them than what may be happening inside them. Research tells us that there are several series of this pruning that occur. The first during preschool and elementary years, and the second begins around 11 for girls, 12 for boys, right about the same time puberty is happening. During this second round of pruning, the volume of gray matter continues to decrease. Most of the pruning in the adolescent brain takes place in the brain's frontal lobes, and we're going to look at all the different areas of the adolescent brain and how it's growing and how it's developing. But most of this pruning is going to take place in the front part of the brain. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Next we're going to move on to the idea of myelination. Recent research suggests that there is a direct relation to their activation and the environmental influences, including repetition of new learning skills that lead to more myelination. So this myelination is that insulation that I was talking about earlier that covers these transmitters, that allows for a more consistent and effective messaging system between different parts of the brain. The second change, which is the second change that happens during the adolescence, and it is not finished until about the age of 20 to 26, depending on the person. And quite frankly, it also depends on some of these environmental influences that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So like I said, we're going to take just a real quick look at what the brain looks like so that we know when we throw out some of these phrases where in our brain this is taking place. The brain develops from the back and works its way towards the front. So myelination happens first in the temporal portion of the brain back here in the back, and then it moves slowly towards the front. This original part of the myelination that's starting in the temporal part, or the temporal and parietal part of our brain starts to happen again around 11 for girls and around 12 for boys, right about the same time that puberty is kicking into high gear. And then it extends throughout the entire adolescent process. As the pruning moves forward into the brain, we see changes occurring in the frontal lobe, which is this section up here. And that starts to happen around the age of 14 to 16 for girls, around 15 to 17 for boys. And it is characterized by really strong peer group influences. And sometimes associated with that is also a little bit of where the conflict with parents start to really happen. And it's a natural pulling away. It's an opportunity and the time when teens really start to discover their independence and really start to think a little bit more about who they are and their own thinking, their own values, their own decisions are trying to be formed. And this is what we call middle adolescence. Late adolescence, the final pruning that occurs in the very front of the brain in the prefrontal cortex. And this starts happening somewhere around the age of 17 and continues to the age of 24, 25 for girls, about 18 for boys, and continues till about the age of 25 or 26. So for those of you who have college age students or young adults who are still acting like, what's wrong with you and what are you thinking? You know, their brains are not yet fully developed. This prefrontal cortex that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes is still not fully developed. Their environment is still having a large influence. Their peers are still having a really large influence. But what you're going to see start to happen as that pruning continues and the myelination continues, is they're going to start to realize that maybe mom and dad knew what they were talking about, and they're going to start having some really great wow moments about how to kind of really prioritize their life and make better decisions. So hang in there. I know you thought it would be over when they graduated from high school, but the truth is they're still developing, they're still growing. And the good news for us is there's still time for us to have influence. So we'll talk a little bit more about that again this afternoon, what our role in this environment is for this adolescent brain growth. So more recent research now suggests that developmental changes and pruning continue, like I said, until the mid or late 20s, as late as 26 for boys. And at that point, we consider the brain to be fully mature. Because the brain is fully mature does not mean that people will make fully mature decisions, right? So I want to make sure we hear that. A fully mature brain does not necessarily equal fully mature decision making. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It is important to consider how we are taking advantage of all of these changes that are occurring, lest we waste the time and the opportunity that we have with them during these really impressive years, right? Many of us that are in the room today are working with teens right at the age that some of this pruning, that most of this pruning and myelination is taking place. And what an opportunity that is for us to be part of that process. Without them knowing it, we are in fact helping their brain develop and mature things that will stick with them for the rest of their lives. And that's an amazing opportunity and something that we really need to consider in the work that we're doing. So by adulthood, fundamental changes in brain structure and function come to an end, and that window of opportunity for us as program facilitators, as practitioners, as parents kind of closes. Doesn't mean we don't have influence, doesn't mean we can't help mold other areas of their life, but the brain as a whole doesn't do much changing once all of this pruning and myelination takes place in those mid-20s. So let's talk a little bit more about this prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the area responsible for planning, making decisions, setting priorities, forming strategies, inhibiting impulsive behaviors. There is a lot going on in this very front part of our brain. It's also where we learn to weigh the pros and cons. It talks about how to put boundaries, how to set our limitations, how to prioritize. And this area of our brain with all of this executive function, some of these really important things, is one of, if not the last part of our brain to mature. So kids, we think, do a T-scale, list the pros, list the cons. Well, that's great if you've got time to sit down and think about it. But we know that during adolescence, most of the decisions that our kids are making are being made in the moment, right? They're not sitting down and making T-charts. They're not thinking about the pros and cons. They're being made literally in the heat of the moment. And we're going to talk about what that looks like and how the heat of the moment affects the adolescent brain, if it does. This means that teens can be more prone to riskier and impulsive behaviors and less likely to consider those consequences than an adult would be. They don't think like we do. And while we would love for them to do that, and while we can certainly teach them how to think that way, we can teach them how to use the T-chart, we can teach them count to 10, we can teach them breathing techniques, take deep breath, relax, try to solidify what's going on, take a look at your environment, consider the consequences. We certainly should be having those conversations. We certainly should be encouraging our teens to think that way. And it's our responsibility as adults in their life to help them think through and learn those decision-making processes. However, when left to their own devices, if just left to where the maturity level and the pruning process of their brain is in place, they can't do it. It's just really difficult for them to weigh out those things. Again, it is the last place that this pruning occurs and the last place that the adolescent brain fully matures. I'm going to take just a minute. This is a really short video, but he does a really great job of kind of summarizing some of the things that we've talked about. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. Hopefully you all will hear it.
As adults, we look back and shudder, but these kids have no idea what they're in for. A perfect storm of hormones producing all matters of growth meant to ready both sexes for adulthood and procreation. Let's say this is the adolescent brain. It grew to this size by around age 5 or 6, but that doesn't mean it's fully built. Think of it instead like a house that's been framed but now needs the interior insulated. Our cells have a natural insulation called myelin. Brain cells have to build it, and that takes years. In fact, the brain isn't fully myelinated and mature until sometime in the late 20s. And here's the thing. This maturation begins at the back of the brain and moves forward, with the very last part of the brain to be fully connected and functional being the frontal cortex, the very part of our brain that is our voice of reason, where we control our impulses and risk-taking behavior. That develops last. So here we have these rather adult-looking teenagers walking around with brains that aren't fully built, being flooded by hormones that stress their coping skills. And that's not all. Even before puberty starts, the preteen brain is growing gray matter right here in the cortex. And that's at the highest rate since babyhood. The cortex is where thought and memory are based. So that gives the preteen brain lots of synapses to use or lose. And lose they will if they don't use it. The brain makes itself more efficient by cutting off those pathways that aren't being developed. So think about it. If you're learning a new sport or a musical instrument, your brain is going to save and keep those abilities. But if you're being a couch potato in front of the television, you get the idea.
So I think he does a really good job. Probably the quickest overview that I've ever seen of everything that we've already kind of talked about. So here's what we're going to do. I know we're only a half an hour in, but I want to go ahead and give you just a minute to think about what you've just heard. Get another cup of coffee. Do whatever you need to do. We're literally going to take a 3-minute break just to kind of transition from what we were thinking about and what we were talking about to the next phase of our conversation. So we are going to take a really quick break. We'll be back in 3 minutes, 5 maybe. All right, enjoy your break. All right, here we go. Oh, I forgot to shrink. I have to shrink all you beautiful faces so I can see my screen and my notes. All right, so we talked about how the teen brain is in this constant state of development. And some areas of the brain mature faster than others. The areas of our brain that are associated with reward, motivation, impulsivity, those mature earlier. Thus, the common teen thought, why not? Right? They like the idea of rewards. They like the idea of, they're easily motivated. So I'm going to share with you this. As I was doing some research, I was reading about this driving simulation that they did with teens. So they put teens in this laboratory and they watched a video game where they were racing cars. And I'm sure some of you have probably done it. They have them at rest areas and in all the arcades and things. You can sit down in a chair and you've got a steering wheel and you get to go like 100 miles an hour and try not to hit barrels and roadblocks and whatever. And so if a teen is sitting in the room in this laboratory and it's fairly quiet and they're just focused on this activity, they drive really well. They avoid the potholes. They're still speeding, don't get me wrong. They're still going as fast as they think they safely can, but that's it, as fast as they safely can. They're avoiding potholes, they're going around the barriers, they're not crashing through roadblocks, you know, they take the detour, they don't go four-wheeling with their mom's Subaru, you know, they kind of stick to the road and they follow the rules. And that's especially true if they're being proctored while they're doing this by an adult in the room. So if they're in this laboratory doing this experiment and they're doing this driving simulation, all is good. Now, bring 3 or 4 other teens in the room and let the proctor leave the room, and it's a whole different scenario. These guys have pedal to the metal, they're crashing through the barriers, they're going off road, they want to see if they can get some air on a hill, right? They don't care if they're going to bend the drive shaft when they land on the other side. And so what does that tell us exactly? Well, what the research is telling us is that teens are so motivated by their environment, and especially when that environment is full of peers, that they are much more likely to engage in risk behavior when the situation is hot and not a cold lab situation. So while we may be able to sit at the dining room table and have great conversations with our kids about the importance of boundary setting and setting realistic expectations, they're going to maybe give you an eye roll because they are teens after all, but they're going to comply, right? They're going to, of course, that's how I'll behave. Of course, I'll make good decisions. Of course, I won't drink. Of course, I won't, whatever it is we're talking about at the moment. And we hope the same thing as we're going into schools or we're doing after school programming or we're mentoring. You know, we're bringing best practice for safe and healthy decision making to all of these teens. And in some of our situations, we hear teens say, yeah, I can do that. I can set that boundary. I know how to do that. Of course, I wouldn't do that. That's not a healthy choice. That's dangerous, whatever. But when they're not in our presence, when they're off to the side with their peers and those hot situations arise, are they really skilled and is their brain really developed? Have they done the right pruning? Has the right synopsis happened where the right things have been pruned away to really be able to make those good decisions? And that's where skill building in our programming really comes into effect. The idea of really allowing teens to practice those skills through role plays and through practice is so important. You know, I have a grandson who's in 5th grade and he struggles a little bit with his math facts. And yesterday Sandy actually has been helping him and was working with him, and she said, Wyland, you gotta do the flashcards. You gotta do the flashcards. You gotta practice, right? That synopsis, he's in 5th grade, he's almost 11, and that pruning is starting to happen, right? He needs to get the math facts down. And Sandy did such a great job yesterday, and I'm going to use this analogy for us today. She said, Wyland, you love to play baseball. How do you get better at baseball? You practice. You go to the batting cages, you use the ball on a stick, I don't know what that thing is called, and you hit it, right? You go out and play catch in the front yard with your brother or with grandpa, whoever. You practice. That's how you get better. The same is true with math facts. You practice. The more you practice, the better you get, the more solidified that's going to be in your brain so that it just becomes a natural thing. The same is so true with us working with our teens. We have to give them the opportunity to practice these skills in a laboratory type setting, classroom type setting, so that when they're in the hot spot, when they're surrounded by their peers and the pressure is on, their brain naturally makes the right decision because they've done the practice. That's kind of just one example of how this practically works. So under those laboratory cold situations where no emotions and no social interactions or pressures were involved, teens actually responded very similarly to the adults. They have the ability to think through a situation and make healthy and safe choices. But when those feelings come into play, the stress is on, peer pressure is happening, it's a little bit different. They're a little bit off, right? All bets are off around whether they're going to make good decisions. And this is important because most of adolescents live the majority of their time in social settings. Now, while we may think during COVID that's not true because of all this physical distancing, it is still so true because they have their cell phones or their iPads or their computers, and they may not physically be connected, but they are still connecting. And the question is, who are they connecting with? What is the environment on this device that they're part of? How many hours every day? So, we're going to talk a little bit later about what we can control and what we can't in the role that we have in an adolescent life. But I'm telling you, we have to consider their environmental influences because it plays such an important part of this whole pruning and synopsis trimming process. All right. So we've got this idea of risky behaviors and safe behaviors and which way are they going to go. We know that these changes have a way of causing teens to have more impulsive behaviors. Remember that whole prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet. So let's take a minute just to consider some of the risks, some of the pressures that adolescents are dealing with on a daily basis. One of the greatest paradoxes of the human lifespan is that teens are generally stronger and healthier than people of any other age group, and yet they face a 200% greater risk of dying than children or adults. That's a lot of a difference, guys. And it kind of comes right here to this idea of risk versus safety. The very characteristics designed to help move an adolescent out into the world to their place of independence are the same traits that make them vulnerable in the world that they live in and all the craziness that goes on in their worlds. It's not that teens are stupid or that they don't have control of their brains. Studies have shown us that teens know exactly what they're doing and most of the time are even aware that they are taking a risk. The question is, does the risk outweigh, does the benefit of the risk or the thrill of the risk outweigh the potential consequences of the risk? And do they really understand the fullness of the consequence of the risk? Because a lot of adolescents, as they're going through this middle adolescent phase, have this Superman mentality where it may happen to you, and I've read about that or I've seen it on the news, but it isn't going to happen to me. It may happen in Chicago, but it's not happening in Gary, right? It may happen to that child in that family, but it's not going to happen to me. It's not going to happen to my child, not in our family. And so we kind of have these teens kind of have that Superman mentality where it may happen to somebody else, but I wear this bulletproof vest and, bullets are going to bounce right off of my chest. So we have to kind of look at that and we have to understand their way of thinking when these risky situations come into their view. So it's important, again, to recognize that every risky choice will have some kind of consequential results. Here's a question. Let's put your answers in the chat box. Do all risky behaviors have negative outcomes? What do you think? Yeah, you're absolutely right. No, not every risky behavior has a negative outcome. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit. But let's go ahead and give me just a couple of ideas. What kind of risky behaviors might actually have a positive outcome? You can either raise your hand and share, unmute yourself, or you can Just put it in the chat, whichever you prefer. Yeah, trying a new trade, right? Trying something new, being challenged, meeting new people, right? Yeah, achieving your dream. See, there's some risk involved there. You have to step out and try something. You have to be willing sometimes to go against what your peers think, or even the idea some adults may think that your dream is a little out there, but you have to be willing to take the risk, right? Yeah, try something that your friends might not be doing. Oh, confrontation, that's a good one. That it's always risky, right? But I hate confrontation. Those who know me know I hate confrontation, but it's a necessary part of living and getting along with your peers. Yeah, standing up for a social cause. I like that. Exactly. There's risk involved there, but it's not necessarily bad. It can be a good thing. Exactly. So not all risk behaviors have negative or harmful outcomes. That's great. Great job. I was glad to see that you all get the fact that there is a need for these teens to be risk takers. And we're going to talk about what our role in that is and what that looks like. Now let's take just a minute and think about some of those risk situations or pressures that may come on our teens that do have harmful or negative outcomes. Go ahead and write just a few of those. What type of risk behaviors are kind of in our kids' face that do have unhealthy or negative outcomes? We're going to do the same thing. Go ahead and put those in the chat. Drooling, drugs, sexting. Yep, yep. Drinking and driving. Yep. Yeah, the whole hookup culture, right? Pornography. Oh, gossiping. That's a good one. Human trafficking, texting and driving. Fitting in. I'd love to hear more about that one. Is that Brianna? Fitting in. How does fitting in have a negative consequence? You want to elaborate on that? Can you unmute?
Sure. Yeah, I unmuted. So I am with the YMCA, and just about a year ago, we started our after-school middle school program, and I have literally watched these kids just take who they are and totally change their personality and the things they're willing to do just to fit in. And it's not always the safest or the most healthy thing, especially when you know that's not how they're being raised, and maybe they could be going down the wrong path. So just trying to fit in could totally change their whole outcome.
Yeah, so great example of how our environment is an influence, right? Our peer group and our environment definitely has an influence. So the way we style our hair, the clothes we wear, the things we do, the way we talk, right? All of those things are influenced by the environment where we place ourselves. That's really great. Great information and great conversation. We're going to go ahead and take a deeper look at just a few of these. We're not going to go through all of them because that would take all of our time, but I want to go through a few of these. Traffic accidents. A lot of you wrote about speeding or texting and driving. Traffic accidents right now are the leading cause of death amongst teens. 7 teens die every day in the United States as a result of car accidents. So yeah, so as we're going through these, just think about, where do we have influence in any of these areas? Is this something we control? Is this something we can provide help with that pruning process, the use it or lose it? Where do we fit in helping making a difference in some of these events? And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Violence. Right now, homicide is the second leading cause of death for teens. In a national survey 40% of males and 25% of females in grades 9 through 12 reported having been in a physical fight in the last year. And more than 25% of males said that they have carried a gun, knife, or club of some type in the last 30 days. And under this, violence is bullying. You know, we could give it its own title, but I'm going to put it here under this idea of bullying. 30%, 1 in 3, 30% of all adolescents in the United States reported being bullied on school property, and 59% reported cyberbullying. That was in the latest YRBS report that just came out not long ago. Peer bullying is associated with suicidal ideations and suicide risk for both the bullied and the bully, right? So not just the person who's on the receiving end, but also for the person who's doing the bullying. I'm just taking a minute. I saw a couple chats come through. Yeah, going back to the whole identity. Teen girls often lose their self-identity in a romantic relationship. So true. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And I know a lot of the folks on the call today are from adolescent pregnancy prevention programs or sexual risk avoidance education programs. And so, of course, with the work, and that's kind of the main point of the work that we do at PATH. So, of course, some of our thinking is kind of bent towards those kind of behaviors. Suicide, the second to third leading cause of death in the United States. It kind of bounces back and forth between the homicide and the suicide. Either way, what we have are our kids are dying. 6,200 and growing US teens die every year in the United States. 16% of 9 to 12 graders have seriously considered suicide. 13% have reported having a plan in place, and 8% have reported having tried to take their own life in the last 12 months. It is a really sad situation. You know, and some of the latest reports with COVID and the isolation and not having the support of trusted adults in their life, you know, so many of our kids, home is not their safest space. Their parent is not their go-to trusted adult. And so when you're restricted on who you can communicate with and who you can see and who you're spending time with, some of these teens have lost that support because they're not in the classroom, or they're not in the sports, on the sports field, or they're not with their mentor, right? So we have to really be paying attention, especially now as school is back in, whether it's e-learning or hybrid, or we really need to be paying attention to some of those suicide warning signs that we have out there. Here's another one. Internet addiction has been associated with loss of functional cognitivity between that prefrontal cortex and the subcortical region, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in just a minute, which is where those emotions take place. And that includes the area of the brain that is really key functional for learning and the learning experience. The article that I read yesterday, which was from 2018, said that 47% of 13 to 17-year-olds have come into conflict with friends and family over their excessive time online, and a third have gone without food or sleep. So, you know I had my granddaughter, and she won't mind me sharing, I'm sure. She's 14 and she spent a month with us this summer. And, you know, she's 14 and it's summer, so bedtime was pretty late. And she has a cell phone and she has an iPad and she has all her things. And she's from Florida, so she came and spent a month with us without her friends, without her peers. And so I expected and anticipated a lot of time on her phone, but it became ridiculous. And sometimes I would go in her room, like just to make sure all was good before I would go to bed. And there she would be under the covers with the glow of the light. And it could be 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, put the thing away. But then in the morning, she didn't want to get up, right? She wanted to sleep till noon or something, which doesn't generally happen at our house. So we have to be careful. And I'm wondering, with all of this e-learning that's happening, are we perpetrating, right? Are we part of the cause now for why these kids are so addicted to their devices at a younger and younger age? My kindergarten granddaughter yesterday got home from her ball game last night, and the first thing she did when she jumped in on the couch was said, "Can I get on my computer now?" Well, trust me, it was not to learn her ABCs and reading. That was not what she was about, right? Kindergarten. And how many of us parents who are working at home are using devices as part of our childcare, right? So I'm not trying to step on toes, just putting out the facts. Don't shoot the messenger. And I have to be honest, I have to consider it for myself. Absolutely consider it myself. And yes, a learned behavior, but is it also a behavior that we're role modeling? How much time are they seeing their parents on their phones and on their computers? Can we sit at the dinner table without taking a call? Can we watch a movie together or play a board game together without being on our phone and being interrupted? You know, how much of our time with our kids is really quality time, and how much of it is being interrupted because of our devices? I think we have to be careful of that too. Yeah, before the internet, it was the TV. And I don't know, is TV one of the devices that they were talking about? I think they were really talking about internet addiction, so I don't think so. But if you add TV time and internet time, way too many hours. It's got to be crazy, right? Absolutely crazy. All right, we're going to look at one more. A minute, I see. Yeah, Anne's just kind of agreeing with what we're talking about there. YouTube is the new TV, right? I don't get it either. The kids watch other kids play games or other adults play games. At least if they're playing their own game, they're using their imagination. But when they're watching gamers do they're not even using their imagination. I don't get it. I don't get it. I'm too old school, I guess. All right, we're going to look at one more. 45% of teens are sleep deprived. So when you're talking about risk behaviors, I didn't see anybody put lack of sleep in the chat box. But teens have a biologic tendency to go to sleep later, and yet many high schools start early, right? So they're getting so few hours of sleep. And some of the articles that I was reading were saying because of this pruning that's taking place at a faster rate even than when they were infants, as we saw in that video, he talked about, you know, it's happening like it did in babyhood. And we know how much sleep babies get. Teens really should be getting like 10 to 12 hours of sleep to allow their brains to really function properly and for that pruning to take place in a really healthy environment. And we know that that's just not even possible. It's just not possible with all that we cram into a day. It's just not possible. Minimally 8 hours. And I know that most teens are not even getting that. Sleep deprivation increases the likelihood that teens will suffer all kinds of negative consequences, including an inability to concentrate, poor grades, drowsy driving, anxiety. Eating disorders have been directly related to the lack of sleep. Depression, thoughts of suicide, and even suicide attempts have been directly related to the fact that teens are exhausted. And when you're exhausted, you all know, you've all pulled late nights or had to pull a double shift or whatever. When you're tired, your brain does not function at its full capacity. It's groggy, it's tired, right? Just like the rest of you. It's tired, it thinks slower, it doesn't think completely. It's just hard. So I wanted to read, so I'm going to read off this paper, so I apologize for that, but I wanted to just share with you this one bit of information that I found in the research as I was doing some work for this. I think high school is the real danger spot in terms of sleep deprivation, said William Dement, a PhD and founder of the Stanford Sleep Disorder Clinic, the first of its kind in the world. It's a huge problem. What it means is that nobody performs at the level they could, whether it's in school, on the roads, on the sports field, or in terms of physical and emotional health. Social and cultural factors, as well as the advent of technology, all have collided with the biology of the adolescent to prevent teens from getting enough rest. Since the early 1990s, it's been established that teens have a biological tendency to go to sleep later, as much as 2 hours later than their adult counterparts or children of a younger age. Yet, when they enter their high school years, they find themselves at schools that typically start the day at a relatively early hour. So their time for sleep is compressed, and many are jolted out of bed before they are physically or mentally ready. In the process, they not only lose precious hours of rest, but their natural rhythm is disrupted as they are being robbed of the dream-rich, rapid eye movement stage of sleep, some of the deepest, most productive sleep time, said a pediatric sleep specialist. So Jeremiah earlier said that one of the risks that adolescents take is going for their dreams. But what we're doing in not allowing them time to sleep is we're cutting those dreams short. So some of the imagination, some of that thought process, the unconscious part of the way they think and the way they process and the way they remember things, all of that stuff that's happening in the brain while our bodies are at rest is being deprived from these young people. Let's take just a minute and look at the chat box one more time.
Yeah, Donna, I was going to point that out. We're having quite a conversation in the chat box.
Yeah.
That if anybody would like to share, I think
saw it lighting up, so I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I agree with what people are saying there, and I would love to hear people's opinion.
Would anyone like to share? Just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Audrey, we can't hear you for some reason.
Can you unmute her? Is she unmuted?
Yeah, she's unmuted and it's still no volume. I'm not sure why.
Her audio is messed up, she's saying.
You know, it's kind of ironic if you look at the chat box and we're talking about multitasking, and I'm kind of multitasking, checking the chat box, trying to work on volume. So my focus is a little bit off, but I agree with what everybody's saying on the chat box about as a society, we almost find it as we value people who are able to multitask. Well, in essence, they are not doing their brain any favors or their health, because it's very hard. Your brain can only focus on one thing at a time. So your brain is going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That creates stress to your body physically, which would make us, you know, age faster. So that's pretty interesting, all these comments.
Yeah, I read a really interesting article recently about that whole idea of multitasking as I'm trying to teach myself some new priority setting and time management skills. And they said that very thing, Sandy, that your brain cannot think about two things at the same time. It's actually turning on and off. And that sometimes what happens is those circuits that we're talking about, that myelination that happens, you know, that we've got that protective layer over those phone lines, if you will. And the older that we are, that myelination has taken place. But in teens, that myelination hasn't completely taken place. So that protective factor that gives them that clear thought isn't even there. And it actually becomes very confusing to them. And like you said, it increases their stress level, which then we're going to talk about this in a minute. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but then it sends out more hormones and it kind of gets their bodies all in this panic. And that part of their brain that still isn't even fully developed, that emotional seat, like goes off the charts, right? And so they are not doing themselves any favor, as especially as teens trying to multifunction. And for us as adults, it's a little more manageable, but that doesn't mean it's good for us, for sure. All right, so before we leave this wonderful adolescent brain development and the science of it all, we're going to talk a little bit about this emotional part of the brain that we just mentioned. Which is the subcortical. I need to change my slide. The subcortical part of the brain, which is the emotional part of the brain. It's located underneath that prefrontal cortex that we were talking about. So that very last part of your brain that's developed, seated underneath of that is this subcortical portion of your brain, where it houses the hippocampus and the amygdala. Most of us have already heard about the amygdala, but sometimes what we think is that little almond-shaped part of the brain is not part, it's part of, but it is not the same as the prefrontal cortex. It actually is seated underneath and has functions completely different. The prefrontal cortex is that logical, executive, organizational thinking. And then seated underneath that are these two things we're going to talk about, the hippocampus and the amygdala. And I should be clicking my buttons. The hippocampus is emotion and memory, and the amygdala is the emotional reactivity. So that's where some of your heightened emotions come from. Your anger, your fear, your joy, your love, you know, when you're really excited. So when those hot buttons are being pushed and when everything is at a highest level, that's where that amygdala is really fully functioning. And again, it sits under that prefrontal cortex, the very last part of the brain that is fully developed and mature. So one of the phrases that we hear, stereotypical of all teens, right? They're drama queens or they're macho men, you know, I mean, they're either, and what words do they use? We're fortunately coming into a time when social and emotional learning is coming back into the presence of the classroom, and we're talking more about emotional literacy. But when you talk to kids about how they feel, they're either bad or they're happy, or they're, you know, their emotional literacy, their words that can express how they feel are super limited. And they're usually extreme. They don't think about the words like frustrated, disappointed, hurt, lonely. Those are very big concepts that underdeveloped amygdala doesn't think of and doesn't know how to process yet. You know, they're not words that they understand and that they know how to do. And if we take a minute to think about this use it or lose it thing, are we teaching our adolescents, when their brains are being developed, how to think and feel that full, vast array of emotions that we have available to us as humans, right? So are we teaching them how to feel and recognize disappointment? Or are they just mad because something didn't go their way? And are they acting angry because something didn't go their way? When really what they are is disappointed, right? But is anyone taking the time to teach them what disappointment is, or what that feeling, how to recognize that? So I'm going to challenge you a little bit around that idea of emotional literacy and the words that we have to describe how we really feel and how we really think about things. Got it, Sandy? Perfect. So this hippocampus is the center of emotion, memory, and certain automatic functions of our body. The amygdala is associated with emotional reactivity and the stronger feelings. And the other parts of that subcortical are instrumental processes also with emotion, but it's part of the learning and memory function. And it's regulated, get this, by sleep and by the amount of sleep or the amount of alertness of the brain. So if we have kids who are sleep deprived, do we wonder why their emotions are all over the place? Yes, no doubt puberty plays a part. Hormones are raging, things are happening. But sleep deprivation completely has a major effect on how this part of the brain is responding. So when we have kids who are really tired and not alert and not aware, and they don't know how to communicate these feelings, is it any wonder that we have kids responding in the way that we do to some of the situations that they're faced with? So while the limbic system finishes developing around puberty, this pruning process that we've been talking about continues. The trimming away of unused portions of the brain matter and the myelination, the rewiring of the brain's communication system, that part of the prefrontal cortex proceeds slowly throughout this entire adolescent years, all the way into the mid-20s. One of the, sorry, I did not click the last button on my slide. You'll have that. So one of the things that I read in preparation for today was a book by Thomas Armstrong called The Power of the Adolescent Brain. And he puts it like this. I'm going to go ahead and put this little quote up on the screen. It might be helpful to think of the limbic system as an accelerator propelling a car along the highway, and the prefrontal cortex as the car's steering wheel and brakes. Because of the gap in time of the development of these two systems, the adolescent brain is a time when the accelerator on a car is being pedaled to the metal, right? Pushed to the floor, and the brakes are not even installed yet. So if they had the brakes, they'd know how to use them. They could push the brakes, but the point is, their brakes are not even fully installed yet. Sometimes once that motion gets going, they literally don't have the skill, the experience, the environment necessary to stop that car from moving, right? I thought that was such a really interesting way to put it. So the bottom line here is this, that in social contexts involving strong feelings, adolescents are more emotionally reactive and emotionally driven and less capable. Not capable, don't get me wrong, they are capable. They are just less capable of rational thinking and decision making. So it's not that they can't make the decision, they can. And the better the environment is that they're in, the better the chances are that they're going to make good choices. But if they are pedal to the metal in a high anxiety, high pressure situation, do they have the skills? Have we taught them enough? Have they been pruned properly so that they can make the healthiest choices in those situations? And that's a question that we have to ask ourselves a little bit as parents, as educators, as program facilitators. Are we doing all we can do to help them during this amazing development time? So we are going to do, I'm just going to put a quick slide on the screen. Oh, here's a picture of the book. If any of you are interested, you can get it on Amazon. That's where I got it. It's an easy read. For such a deep subject, it's a pretty easy read. And it has a lot of strategies that we're going to get into later today. So if you like what we talk about this afternoon after lunch, you might want to grab the book. If it steps on your toes too much, don't get the book, because it's going to challenge you. It's going to challenge you. So here is a review. I'm going to just give you guys a few moments to kind of take this in. Remember that the adolescent brain develops from the back here where it's saying peer pressure resistance, all of that, it develops from the back towards the front. And I think this is hilarious. It's so, you know, they say that comedy has, all good comedy has some portion of truth to it, and that's what makes it so funny. And I think that's really what I love about this cartoon. Yeah, I see that. Internet, she's saying internet and phone addictions are at the back. So that just tells us that that pruning is happening there. So we have opportunity at an earlier age. So this tells us kind of where we need to, what is age appropriate teaching, right? At an earlier age, when puberty first starts and the synopsis process and pruning process first starts, that's where we need to be working. These are the things we need to be working on. You see car keys. My grandson's only almost 11, like I said, and he's already talking about when he can drive. That's 10 years, 5 years away. But yeah, he wants the car keys. Can't wait to drive. Yeah, there's probably some truth to that. She's saying that she doesn't think the placement in the cartoon has as much meaning other than comedy. And that's probably true. That's probably true. But I did get permission to use this, by the way. I sent a quick email to the Lake Off the Mark and told him I was just going to use it in an educational seminar, and he said, of course. I have to be honest, I didn't do enough research to be able to tell you how much validity there is. We may have someone on the call that's more in tune with this whole medical side of things that could chime in here. I see Todd Willis is with us. He kind of does some of this conversation. He might be able to add more to how accurate the placement of these things are. All right. So in all seriousness, we're going to go ahead and move on. We're going to watch one more short video. I think. Nope, we're not. I lied. It must be later. I forgot to change my notes on my page. Sorry, guys. There's another video coming up in a few minutes. So what we're going to do now is think just for a few minutes. Sorry, I'm trying to. I got totally distracted. I'm sorry. All right, I'm back. I'm back. I needed a brain break, I guess. So what are they thinking and how are they thinking? We've kind of talked about this a little bit. So we're going to talk just a few minutes about how all of these changes that are happening, this pruning process, the synapses trimming, how all of this makes them think. What's going on up there, right? I don't know about you, but if you have teens in your life, or maybe even preteens, you have to just hold your head sometimes and go, what in the world are they thinking, right? What are they thinking? So we know that they're not thinking fully mature thoughts, and that they don't even have all of the tools up there to be able to think that way. But what we do know is that social and emotionally heated situations have a really big impact on how and what a teen thinks. Teens have different neural patterns in their thinking process. They seek pleasure and rewards differently than adults do, and even differently than children do. Research shows us that they are primed for big rewards, not little ones. Little rewards will get little results. If you want results, you need big rewards, right? So I'm going to go back to Sandy yesterday, working with my grandson on his math facts. It is amazing what he would do for a couple of Sour Patch Kids. She had a little bag of Sour Patch Kids sitting on her desk, and she's like, when you do those 2 math problems, you can have 2 more Sour Patch Kids. And he's like, cool, I want Sour Patch Kids. And he did his work, and she gave him the Sour Patch Kids, and all was good. That is not going to work for our teenagers when we're talking about things like drugs, alcohol, driving, and sex. You can give them bags of Sour Patch Kids, and it is not going to work. So what kind of rewards can we offer? What kind of rewards do they have to have in the front of their mind? Where is their thinking have to take place to get them to make these really healthy decisions, right? That's kind of what we have to be thinking about. So another study suggests that these teens are willing to take the big risks for the big rewards because of the feelings that it gives them. They want the excitement, they want that adrenaline rush, they want the release of dopamine, right? And so you can get that. We talked earlier about what are some of the healthy risks that teens can take that give them that same excitement, right? And so that's kind of how we have to think about things in our program. What can we encourage them with? But more than what we can do is how can we teach them to think that way for themselves? How can we help them understand that the positive outcomes are worth the positive risks, and the negative outcomes are not worth the negative risks? That's kind of like the lifelong question, right? That's the question that we all wish we had a really great answer for. Oh, I see some ideas coming into the chat box. That's great. Yeah, you also have to know your kids, right? Because some kids are motivated by one thing and other kids are motivated by a totally different thing. Like I have my one granddaughter loves to walk, and she's like, if I can say, if you can get all this, if you can get your chores done by 4 o'clock, we'll have time to take a nice walk and we'll go, to the park or whatever. And she loves that kind of stuff. So that motivates her. If I would say that same thing to my grandson, I will tell you he will never get that work done because he does not want to walk to the end of the driveway. So you have to know your kids to know what's going to motivate them. So that's kind of important for sure. So we'll go back. Remember the driving simulation that we talked about earlier? Several researchers suggested that adolescents are neurologically primed to experience the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. This is far more true for teens than it is for adults or for children. Remember, we talked about the amygdala and that hippocampus seated under the prefrontal cortex. The last place that pruning occurs, the emotional seat of the brain. Emotions are extreme and unstable during the teen years. An important system in the adolescent brain that fuels these out of proportion reactions to the presence or absence of reward or social interaction is represented by a dopaminergic pathway. So I mentioned the word dopamine earlier, and we're going to talk about it now. In the chat box, just write a couple of words about what you know about dopamine. What do we know about dopamine? Excuse me. No one's writing, so I must be going to bring some new information, or you're just not paying attention. Either way. So, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a major role in reward-motivated behavior and sensation seeking. This chemical is released when extreme emotions are present. If you've ever heard someone say, you know, like, I get such a high, yeah, feels good, right? Makes you feel good. I get such a high when like for me, we just went to Indiana Beach last weekend, and I know it's small, and I know their roller coasters are small, but I love roller coasters. A high, dopamine released for sure. Something as simple as eating a soft pretzel at 8 o'clock last night at the ballpark probably released a little dopamine for me because I love them and I don't treat myself to them very often. So it may be a really big thing that would release a lot of dopamine. It may be a small thing that releases a little bit of dopamine. Dopamine is also what is released when you do drugs. So that rush, the high from marijuana or the high from using heroin, that dopamine released. So yeah, hormones that play a part in the brain. So other neurotransmitters that play a significant role are oxytocin and serotonin. We're going to take a minute to look at those. Oxytocin often works with dopamine to link social connections to feelings of reward. The chemical's abundant presence during the teen years heightens the value that they attach to being with and bonding with others, particularly with their peers. Serotonin is associated with mood, appetite, and sleep. See, that sleep just keeps coming back. When optimally functioning, which is not the case when teens are sleep deprived, serotonin leads to well-being and happiness. So low serotonin levels in adolescents have been linked to loneliness, eating disorders, depression, self-harming behaviors like cutting. Does it sound a little bit like sleep deprivation? There's obviously a link there. Girls seem to be particularly hard hit by serotonin fluctuations, perhaps because of the rising level of sex hormones, especially estrogen, seem to be linked to a little bit of that regulation and the pathways in the brain and the connectivity. So something to consider if you've got an adolescent girl in your home, are they getting enough sleep? And maybe have their serotonin levels checked, which is something that your doctor can do to see, you know, if their estrogen may be a little out of whack. So they tend to be a little moody. They tend to have a little bit of appetite suppressant usually, and they can struggle with sleep. So whether it's self-induced sleep deprivation or sleep deprivation because of this serotonin imbalance, definitely can contribute to some of these other things going on. So again, loneliness, eating disorders, depression, and even self-harm has been seen to be related to inadequate serotonin levels. So we're going to talk a minute about this stereotypical teen behavior, and I'm going to quote Thomas Armstrong again from his book. What and why are they thinking the way they are? The average teenager has a brain that is wired for sensation seeking, risk taking, and craves attention from their peers. Their emotions are heightened and unstable. They are vulnerable to countless insults and injuries on the road to maturity. The stereotype of the adolescent as an impulsive, erratic, moody, and hypersensitive creature, although partly true, ignores an important question. If adolescence is such an unstable period of life, why weren't the behaviors associated with this stage eliminated from the gene pool a long time ago? The answer to this question is that the traits associated with adolescence have been designed to meet very specific tasks that the teenagers need to accomplish to become contributing members of society and mature adults. So these very things that we're looking at, stereotypical, often considered negative behaviors, like how can we just get them to quit behaving like this and thinking like this, are the very things that they need as part of that maturing process. So rather than trying to figure out how we can eliminate these things in their lives, we need to figure out how we can use them to our advantage and to theirs, right? He goes on to say, the combination of sex hormones which propel adolescents toward finding a mate and a brain designed to take risks during these precious years means that adolescents will find the world out there more attractive and rewarding than the childhood home in which they spent their whole lives. Their desire to spend more time with peers than those at home or other authority figures also prepares them for their adulthood, where most of their social and professional interactions are with peers. Right? I'm just going to leave that sit there and let you read that again for just a moment. This full pruning and maturing process with all of the rewiring of communication within the brain is referred to as neuroplasty, which is the ability of the brain to form new connections, modify structures in response to their environment, physical injury, behavior, neural processes, and other influences. Let's think for just a minute about things like ACEs, right? Where does that play if we have adverse childhood experiences taking place in the environment that these teens are growing up in? What is that doing to that pruning process? What things are being reinstilled and reinforced in their brain? And what things are they really missing? Are they being reinforced with stability? Are they being reinforced with support? Are they being reinforced with acceptance and empowerment? Or are they being reinforced in negative thoughts? Are they being told they're not good enough, that they'll never amount to anything? What are the messages that our adolescent brains are receiving? And what is being strengthened in their brain? What is being used and what is being lost? To quote Mr. Armstrong just one more time, as middle school and high school educators, and I would add to that parents, mentors, program providers, and youth workers, we need to appreciate the fact that although we confront an adolescent's moodiness, impulsiveness, and rashness, we also encounter the teen's exuberance, passion, idealism, sensitivity, creativity, and caring for others, all qualities that can make a significant positive contribution to the betterment of society. Maybe, just maybe, we need to start looking at teens a little bit differently. And my guess is that many of us in the room today already do that. We're here because we care about teens. You know, I don't know how many of you, like me, will tell someone what you do, and their response is, better you than me, right? They don't want to deal with teens and all of their stereotypical awesome things that are happening in their brain. They don't want to deal with that. Like, give me a child and give me an adult, but those teen years, you can have them. You can have them. But for those of us who have the privilege and the honor of working and dealing with adolescents every day, it's just that. It's a privilege. And it's also a responsibility that we have to take pretty seriously. So I'd like to now take a minute for you to share your thoughts. I'd like to think about what he said for just a minute, that phrase that I left on the board that I asked you to read. What are some key words that really stuck out to you about what he said? I'm going to back up just 1 second and let you look at it one more time. I have about 3 more minutes, and then we will be taking our lunch break. All right? Yeah, some really great comments. I see you guys putting. Yeah. Awesome. Oops, I went one screen too far. All right, I am going to show this last video, and then we will be dismissed for lunch. Well, we'll be dismissed to our lunchroom. Sandy will explain that to you in just a minute. Here's the video.
The adolescent period is absolutely amazing. People often give it a negative approach, saying, oh, it's a time where adolescents are going to lose their mind, or they're just immature, or raging hormones drive them crazy. These are all not only wrong, but they're myths that mislead us and actually disempower us. Whether we're adults or adolescents, they actually give us the wrong message.
Sorry, my fault.
The adolescent period is absolutely amazing. People often give it a negative approach, saying, oh, it's a time where adolescents are going to lose their mind, or they're just immature, or raging hormones drive them crazy. These are all not only wrong, but they're myths that mislead us and actually disempower us. Whether we're adults or adolescents, they actually give us the wrong message, and they make it so there's nothing we can do. So what is actually the truth? The truth is that instead of raging hormones, what's happening is we have remodeling in the brain. In ways we never could have predicted, we now understand 2 big things are happening in the brain. Things you as an adult can support adolescents in developing well, and if you're an adolescent, you actually can use this to help your brain grow in an optimal way. What are those 2 things? The brain is pruning itself. So imagine that in childhood, you're growing like a tree and establishing all these branches and all these leaves are growing. In the brain, that means connections among the basic cell, the neuron, called synapses, are being established, and you're soaking in the knowledge of the world, and that's beautiful. The tree is just growing, growing, growing. But then what happens, that surprised everyone, is the brain begins to prune itself. You start carving away some of those leaves, some of the smaller branches, even some of the larger branches. And the reason for the pruning is to specialize the brain. While the child is developing in ways that are really generalized, learning everything they can about everything they can, an adolescent is going to begin to find their passion, to actually find things they like, things they really love doing, and to drive their development in that way. So pruning.
I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm gonna catch it up. Hang on.
In an optimal way. What are those two things? The brain.
Hang on, sorry.
Everything they can about everything they can. An adolescent is going to begin to find their passion, to actually find things they like, things they really love doing, and to drive their development in that way. So pruning is actually a use it or lose it principle underneath it. That if you don't use something, you're going to lose it. So if you like sports or like dancing or like music, do those things so you continue to establish those circuits. The second thing that happens in the remodeling adolescent brain is myelin formation. Myelin is a healthy sheath that allows connected neurons to communicate with each other in a much more effective way. How? It's 100 times faster, the signal that's sent down a neuron to communicate with another neuron, 100 times faster, and after it fires off, it's 30 times shorter the resting period that happens. 30 times 100 is 3,000. So when you've put down myelin, you've made your neurons communicate 3,000 times more effectively. That's a great thing. Now, the great thing, too, is that you as an adolescent can actually use the focus of your attention to be aware of your emotions, aware of other people, to be engaging in activities, to be doing things with your thoughts that actually reinforce the parts of your brain you want to hold on to. So the good news about the remodeling story is that a field called neuroplasticity, how the brain responds to experience, shows us that what you do with your mind can change the activity and therefore the structure of your brain. So if you then come up with the statement that the ultimate goal of brain remodeling is to make an integrated brain, to differentiate areas, that's the pruning, and myelinate them, that's the linkage. When you increase differentiation and linkage, you make the brain more integrated. And an integrated brain is the pathway toward well-being. And you can do mind-sight exercises. These are exercises that increase insight, empathy, and integration. And if you do them as an adolescent, and you can also do them as an adult, you'll actually increase the integration of your brain as your brain is growing, not just during adolescence, but throughout the lifespan. And what's the outcome of integration? When integration is made visible, it's kindness and compassion. And so what we see through adolescent development is that our relationships become built on connections that are deep and filled with honoring each other's vulnerability, that's kindness, and supporting connections that are compassionate, filled with a sense of caring about other people and wanting to help them. This is the kind of world we can build as we move through life and support each other in our development.
All right, we are going to skip the morning takeaways and we are going to be dismissed to our lunchrooms. And Sandy will take just a minute and explain to you how that's going to work.
Okay, hi everyone. In just a minute, I'm going to divide you up into different chat rooms, breakout rooms where you can talk with other people attending today. We're going to have 4 in a room approximately. And at that time, you can talk about any takeaways you've had from the morning session, or you can talk about how this applies in your life. You can talk about things that are personal, or you feel more comfortable that way. And we're going to also send you some questions to kind of stimulate that conversation. while you're in the chat room. So right now, you can eat your lunch at the same time. I have mine sitting right in front of me. So we'll give you a minute to grab your lunch and then join in on your breakout room. See you in a bit.
Has everybody found their room? I'm going to pause the recording while we take our 30-minute lunch break. We present to teens that would engage them in their need for peer acceptance. Who has some ideas? Sandy, can you just read those out for me?
Sure. Sports clubs, etc., peer mentoring.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, great. And then we also know that peer acceptance could lead to dangerous outcomes. For example, we know that a lot of the reason that teens are joining gangs is for that idea of acceptance. What other kind of things, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, what kind of activity could lead to dangerous outcomes as they're trying to meet their need for peer acceptance? Yeah, substance abuse. So the idea is to consider what their need is. In this case, their need is for peer acceptance. And what can we do to help meet that need in their life so that they do things in a positive way versus doing things in a negative way.
You know, the social media challenges that started with like the Tide Pods and those kinds of things. I think that is a reason why kids do those, is to be accepted by their peers.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. It may also fit into this idea of risk taking, right? So we know that they want that dopamine high. They're looking for things that are exciting. Remember, big rewards give you big results. So what kind of things might we do or encourage them to do that are positive? We mentioned it a few in the chat box earlier today. One idea that we just had at a recent conference, and I want to figure out how to do this, and I'm going to pull on some of my staff that are musically talented to figure this out. But I think open mic night would be really fun. So what other kind of, a chance for them to use some of their skills and their talents and really put themselves out there? That's a healthy risk, right? So what might be either a healthy risk or a dangerous risk? Any ideas around risk taking? Oh, bumper cars. Yeah, that would be fun and risky, right? Stepping out of your cooking competition. I like that idea, Brianna. Yeah, TikTok videos. There's some danger involved in those for sure. Art show, great idea for positive use of risk taking. All right, we're going to move on. Sensation seeking, and this is kind of this similar to the risk-taking idea, but a little bit different. So one of the recommendations that I read about was student-initiated learning projects. Oh, field day activities, that's a good idea. Might be really good for middle school age kids. That anything competitive really takes a risk. And that sensation seeking, I think that's where a lot of the substance abuse comes in, and maybe even some of those like the Tide Pod challenge and those things could be sensation seeking too. I know there's one going around right now with like a chip of some kind that is like so hot you can't hardly handle it. And the idea is to see if you can eat one and then not drink or eat anything for 5 minutes. And like there's people like looking for the closest garbage can. Thanks, Brianna, for joining us today. Okay, another need that we know they have is this reward seeking, right? Turn into something positive. Game-based learning simulations. We've talked about that a little bit with our programming. What can we do with kids wanting to be and having to be online? How can we make our programming more interactive? And how do you reward those kind of things? You know, that can be a tricky one. And then at the same time, we don't want to encourage internet addiction. We're going to look real quickly at 8 recommendations for brain-friendly learning. And I'm going to go through each one of these. And then what I'd like to do at the end is kind of just have some conversation around how we can put these things into practice in our programming. So the first one is opportunities to choose. Because the prefrontal cortex of the teen brain, that seat of decision making, is gradually maturing, teens often make unhealthy choices during this time. They need frequent opportunities to make decisions for themselves. This provides adolescents opportunities to learn and make less risky and more sensible decisions in life. So that the question that you want to ask yourself here is, where can you give teens the chance to really choose rather than making the choice for them? You know, when they ask you about going somewhere or doing something, help them, teach them to think through the process. Do you think it's a good idea? How, you know, what have you thought about that idea? Who's going to be there? What are the risks involved? So, you know, engaging them in the conversation and teaching them to think about their options. The second one, self-awareness activities. More and more research is allowing us to understand that regions within the adolescent brain relate to an emerging sense of self. It is critical for any middle or high school classroom or program to integrate activities that help students explore and express their own emerging sense of self. These opportunities assist teens in defining their developing sense of identity. So we want to, like we were talking about earlier, right? Is it music? Is it dance? Is it sports? Is it math? Is it science? Are they great spellers and should be involved in a spell bowl somewhere? What activities can we encourage them to participate in that are positive risk-taking activities that lend to who they are as an individual? How can we support and encourage those? Peer learning connections. We've talked a lot about the importance of peer interaction, peer influence, but mostly in a negative way, right? But peer connections can be really good. Those can be their greatest support systems. And if they've got the right friends, they can be their greatest cheerleaders. So it's not that we don't want them to engage in peer connections, we do. We want them to make sure that the choices that they're making and who their friends are good, healthy choices. Because peer involvement is so important at this time of life, we have to be willing to relinquish some of the controls and influences in favor of peer learning opportunities. Some of you, I think, put peer mentoring in one of the lists earlier. One of the programs that we offer at PATH is a peer mentoring program. And we know that peers learning from peers in a positive, controlled environment really works very, very well. Students learn to collaborate, exchange ideas, and interact with one another in a healthy and positive way. We should capitalize on their preference for hanging out with their peers. When you think about in college, there's study groups all over the place. Do we need to reinforce the idea of study groups, with our middle school and high school students? And I was thinking about that even with all of the e-learning that's happening. How easy would it be for some kids to get together on a Zoom call like this and work through their problems of, their homework together and have conversations and be learning from one another and with one another? Really a good way to use the tools that are available to us. And you can get a free Zoom account that would allow them ample opportunity to do those kind of things. Just an example. Number 4, effective learning. When the adolescent limbic system is in full throttle, there are generally 2 ways we can respond. Either we can ignore the fact that emotions are happening and become punitive when they inevitably erupt, like that kid who acts out in class, or we can accept those emotions and integrate them into the conversation in programming. Can those outbursts, can those inappropriate moments be turned into teaching opportunities? Not just maybe for the child who's acting out, but for the class as a whole. Certainly not by calling him out or being punitive in front of his peers. That would be inappropriate. But how can we use that group situation to be a teaching moment for everyone that's involved? Consider how you can blend the emotional brain with the rational thinking that's trying to take place in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Number 5, learning through the body. This one is going to require just one more science lesson. We're going to talk a little bit more about an area called the cerebellum that's in the back of the skull. So one of the earlier places that this pruning and development takes place. The small part of the brain that possesses a high degree of neuroplasticity. So there's a lot more room there for growth. There's a lot more room there for change. It's much more pliable. And it's very responsive to environmental influence. It plays an important role in motor functions like running, jumping, dancing. So when you're thinking about that, it's easy to see how we do that with elementary students, right? But how can we do that with our middle school and high schoolers? How can we keep them moving and not just having them sit in a chair and, play their video games or watch their lessons? How can we get them up and moving? One of the things that frustrates me a little bit, even as great as all these Zoom meetings are, I love to do things that get kids up and moving. And I'm sure many of your programs like ours have kids that get up and move, and there's demonstrations and kids volunteer. You want to get them active. So how can we do that? How can we make sure that we're using that part of their brain so that it's not lost? It plays an important role in that higher cognitive functions. There's a direct link. One of those synapses that's happening is the link between the physical movement part of their brain and the thinking part of their brain. There's a direct connection there. How can we strengthen those connections? So how can we incorporate more physical activity into how we relate with our teens? And how can we bring the idea of teaching these skills to the table? 6, metacognitive strategies. That's a mouthful. Jane Piggott is a scientist who suggests that starting around the age of 11 or 12, just when there is a spike in gray matter development, that teens move into a new stage of thinking. He characterized it as a time when it is possible, he characterized it as a time when it becomes possible to think about thinking. How can we incorporate critical thinking skills into our work? Journaling is a great example of this. Allow them to hear an idea and then find ways for them to think about it, ponder it. How can they own it? How can they make it real to themselves? How can we challenge them to consider the way that they're thinking? Then number 7, express art activities. Adolescence can and should be a time of great creative and artistic development. Specific regions of the brain, the bundle of nerve fibers that divide the brain in two, so that very center part of their brain that runs from the back to the front, increases robustly between the ages of 5 and 18. Expressive art activities such as painting, sculpting, music, drama, even photography represent a strategic way to channel that subcortical energies of the teen years into thoughtful and possibly even socially appropriate representations. How can it become a social movement? It strengthens the links between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic part of the brain. And lastly, number 8. As we've already discussed, by the age of 15 or 16, teens do as well as adults on tests regarding executive functioning in that cold lab situation. But in those hot situations that we were talking about earlier, where peers are present or there's outside stresses and environmental pressure, not so much. Their ability to think rationally, considering the difference between the pros and the cons and the consequences, greatly diminished in those situations. This means that teaching teens to plan, organize, think ahead, inhibit those impulses, and engage other healthy and mature ways of thinking is most effective when these efforts take place in an environment where the teen is comfortable, where they feel like they are in a safe space, where they're not feeling stress and pressure from their peers or outside circumstances. This type of situation can be simulated, but there's no substitute for real-world experience. This is where an opportunity for small peer group connections and small group role-playing and learning and practicing can be really important. It's also a great opportunity for peer mentoring, whether with an upperclassman or with a college student or even a young adult, someone who can exemplify to them and walk them through some of life's real situations. So those are the 8 recommendations. Those are spelled out more clearly in Mr. Armstrong's book that I mentioned to you earlier. I really recommend that you take the time to look at that. It's an easy read, so it's super informative. I know that it's a huge challenge to work with teens in today's crazy and constantly changing world, even more so now that COVID has brought in new opportunities and challenges. Every day we face students who lack motivation, whose attention wanders while we're trying to do a lesson, who engage in off-task socialization on their phones while you're trying to teach a lesson, texting with their peers. Maybe they come to a session in some way impaired by drugs or alcohol. It's easy in such situations to get hard. It's easy in those situations to get frustrated. It's easy to just go through the motions and check off the boxes. Got that lesson done. Did that. It's easy to get to the place where we can become complacent in our work and we forget the importance of who it is that we're working with and why we're doing what we're doing. So I just really want to encourage you to take the time to remember your who, remember your why. I am sure that sometime during our conversation today, even as we were going through some of these recommendations, you thought of a particular student that you, for whatever reason, either frustrates the heck out of you or has a place in your heart for some particular reason that you think, you know what, maybe that'll work. And that's my hope for today, is that you learn something that you can take back and make a difference in the life of your who. And I hope that today's conversation reminded you of your why, and empowered you and refreshed you to do your work just a little bit better. So that's all I have for today. Like I said, I had a little bit more, but I'm going to let it go. I want to really thank you. I don't know what's happening to my screen. Oops. I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for taking part in all of our conversations, putting your comments in the chat. I hope you enjoyed your lunch with your peers and made some new connections there. And I just want to remind you that you really can and you really are making a difference. With that, I will open it up to any last minute questions or comments before we close today. Sandy, anything in the chat?
All kinds of thank yous, but I want to thank all of the participants because this was a very interactive session, and it was only because of the participants that they were responding. So thank you for being engaged and responding, and your enthusiasm for what you do for teens is greatly appreciated.
All right, you all enjoy your afternoon, and please, when you receive your emails tomorrow, take the time. It won't take long, probably 5 questions on the evaluation so that we can make sure we're meeting your needs. All right, you all have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.